All right, welcome everybody that's joining. We have folks coming in from the waiting room now. Just to be sure, we are in meeting mode so that we can have a Q&A at the end of this. If you're coming in, please make sure you're muted if you're not already muted when you join us. That would be appreciated. And we'll get started here in just a minute. Also, while you're coming in, before we get started, if you'll drop your name and where you're joining us from in the chat, we always appreciate that. It's good for us in our reporting as well. You know, everybody wants their data and reporting, so we appreciate adding that information. All right, I'll give one more minute for folks to join us and get dialed in. Excellent. Okay. Well, it is just after noon my time here in Central Time Zone. So thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn. Whatever coast and time zone you're joining us, I hope you've grabbed something to eat and are able to participate today and learn some more about the history of the Preeclampsia Foundation. They are celebrating, or say they, we are celebrating our 25th anniversary this month. And so we wanted to have an opportunity to hear from the leaders of the Preeclampsia Foundation and sharing the journey that has gotten us to this point. So it's going to be an exciting discussion today. If you are just now joining us, please do drop in the chat where your name and where you're joining us from. So we have an attendance report for our folks that help us make these things possible. Our agenda today, I'm going to give you a super brief overview about Mama's Voices. I will introduce you to our main speaker and then hand it over to them to do and share more about celebrating 25 years of the Preeclampsia Foundation. If you are new to Mama's Voices, we are a program of the Preeclampsia Foundation. We are really here to make sure that the patient voice is and Mama's voices are integrated as partners wherever maternal health improvements are needed. We are I call agnostic arm. The extension of what we do is open and available for other patient advocacy organizations, community-based organizations, and support groups as well that can utilize and leverage our resources to amplify their own missions as well. We do have currently right about 44 different Mama's Voices partners, or MVPs. And so the Preeclampsia Foundation is always, of course, one of our MVPs listed here. And this is an opportunity, these lunch and learns that we offer for MVPs to be able to share more about their organizations, their missions, some things that they want on a shared platform to get their message out as well. So if you are interested and you are joining us today from a kind of organization, feel free to fill out our interest form and we will follow up with you. One other thing I just want to highlight, we have done so much work this past year on developing our substance use disorder resource hub on the Mama's Voices website. The tools and resources here are phenomenal. They were built with people that have experienced substance use disorder, and been vetted by them. They helped us co-create them and co-design them. We were very proud of this project. The resources that came out of it are phenomenal and are also really applicable to anybody. They're universal resources. So if you have a minute, check that out and you can look at our pregnancy plan. Coping mechanisms is another one I'm very proud of. And some other things as well about focus groups and listening to patients. So great resources there. And lastly, I will get to introduce Eleni. I will let you all read her bio, but I will tell you, I have known Eleni now for more years than I can count or math at this point. We've been around each other in the space for a very long time. She has been the CEO of the Preeclampsia Foundation for, I think, 15 years. And I have probably, I think, known her 14 of those 15. So I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our leader of the Preeclampsia Foundation and visionary of what we do here, Eleni Tsigas.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I think it's actually even been longer than 15, but hey, who's counting? When we're here to celebrate 25 years, there's a little bit of shock that we all go through. Like
We're
when
just
our,
celebrating our anniversary of that milestone. That's what we're
yeah,
doing at this
yeah,
point.
absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, let me pop my screen, my slides up on the screen here, and hopefully the technology will all be working for us. Everyone can see my full screen.
Perfect.
Awesome, awesome. Oh my gosh. Well, this is very exciting. For those of you who have not been exposed before to the Preeclampsia Foundation, as the name implies, we are here for and about preeclampsia, but we definitely take a patient advocacy perspective to everything that we do. As our purpose statement says there, we are patients advocating for improving healthcare practices, advancing research, and educating, supporting, and engaging families affected by preeclampsia and really all hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. So I'm going to just start. Nicole said she's coming to us from Central Time Zone. I'm coming to us from our headquarters here in Florida. I live here where the Preeclampsia Foundation is headquartered. And we are in hurricane season right now. So, despite what you might hear in the news, hurricanes don't happen that often, but we have to take them seriously here. We do a lot of preparation, scenes like boarding up your windows, not terribly unusual. Getting information from tracking models, ensuring that we have the right supplies at home. Most of the time, I got to tell you, all of this turns into nothing too serious. And and we're always watching. We're always on alert. Back in 2017, we had Hurricane Irma, one of several, that hit us pretty hard. We were constantly looking at spaghetti plots, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon because you have people who might look at a spaghetti plot like this and look at the outlier model and focus on that. So those are who we call the eternal optimists, like the quote below. So you're telling me there's a chance it may not hit us, right? These are the avoiders of reality. The bottom line is that you have to have a really healthy respect for how destructive a hurricane could be and recognize its unpredictability and the fact that, yeah, it may be much ado about nothing, but you ignore it at your own peril. I find that you might be wondering why is she talking about hurricanes? It's because pregnancy is like that. We have to respect its potential for destruction. It's unpredictable. It may be much ado about nothing, but you ignore the facts at your own peril. Most of the time, it goes beautifully. Like when I had my ultrasound and my husband and I first laid eyes on our baby, nothing could possibly go wrong. We were filled with so much joy and anticipation and love. There were no warnings or considerations for the possibility that something could go wrong. There was no preparation with information that could empower us to be what I call better first responders. There were no special tests to give us a more accurate model of what could be in store for us until disaster struck. And I found myself at the graveside of my daughter, weak from my own near fatal encounter with preeclampsia, severe preeclampsia. And I know that there are people on this call who can also tell you that literally nothing prepares you for recovering from the worst disaster of your life, which is the loss of your child. For me, this loss sent me on a journey of questions. And I wondered, amongst other questions, what if my doctor had ever told me why my blood pressure was being checked and I was peeing in a cup at every prenatal visit? What if I knew that for me, my body, a blood pressure of 140/90 was reason enough to go directly to the hospital? What if the nurse on the phone took a more cautious approach when I reported severe swelling and asked me to come in to be checked because I hadn't been seen in 3 weeks? And on and on. There are other questions on this slide that I grappled with. And I suffered from self doubt, I suffered from anger, guilt, just a myriad of emotions that took a long time to work through. But ultimately, I was left with some very practical questions that frankly needed answers. Almost 30 years ago, this was the state of obstetrics, a total lack of information for patients, doctors and nurses who frequently lacked a healthy respect for just how dangerous and preventable these poor outcomes could be, and healthcare systems that didn't prioritize listening to patients and didn't have the resources and protocols that would prevent medical errors. I found the Preeclampsia Foundation about a year after it was started by another survivor and her doctor in Seattle. And I realized I could work within this structure to right these wrongs, to get answers to these questions. And not just for me, but for the 200,000 other families every year who would suffer similarly. At the time, I was working in strategic communications with Fortune 100 companies, which in part explains my drive to get answers. I went on to have two adorable boys, not without their own dramatic entrances, and I volunteered for the Preeclampsia Foundation in various capacities for several years until the board approached me to become the executive director in 2009. So that's a little bit about my journey. Let's take a moment to do a poll. I want to find out a little bit more about you, who's on the call, and what your motivation is for joining us today. Could we get the poll up online? We're just going to take a few seconds to answer this. Hopefully you can skim through this pretty quickly. We just want to know who you represent, sort of what's your story for showing up today. Okay, and we have a second question. It looks like we've got a nice mix of about 28% are survivors, a few family members, 36% are healthcare providers of various kinds, and 11% are other maternal health advocates, not necessarily personally affected by any maternal health conditions. And then some other folks, about 11%, who are maternal health advocates not affected by preeclampsia. All right, I think we have a second question. Can we pop that one up too? Basically, what we want you to do is rank order what you would most want to learn about today in the three categories that we've presented here. More about the Preeclampsia Foundation, our history, and sort of how we got to where we are, more about preeclampsia as a medical condition, and a little bit more about research that's underway right now. So feel free to rank order those. Hopefully the poll is allowing you to do that. Lots of interest in the research that's underway. That's interesting. That's great. We're going to do our best to lean into the emphasis that you all are sharing here. Let's go ahead and end the poll and get into our content. This is helpful. We have another speaker besides myself today, and we're going to do our best to leave time at the end for Q&A to get into some of these questions and cover some of these topics. So specifically, our agenda for today, we're going to start with what's the problem we're trying to solve, and we're going to get a brief medical explanation from the chair of our medical advisory board, Dr. Ira Bernstein. And we are going to drop a little bit in some of his bio into chat so you can read more about him. We are also going to do a very fast overview of what we do here at the Preeclampsia Foundation, because we do a lot and there's no way I'm going to cover all of it, but I want to give you a sense of scope. And then kind of an interesting exercise as I was preparing this talk is really trying to analyze, like, how did we get here? For 25 years, we've been educating, engaging, equipping, and elevating. And clearly, we have learned some lessons over that time. And so I want to share some of that with you all. So, with that, let's go ahead and pull up Dr. Bernstein's slides. And as I said, we're going to drop into chat more about his bio. He comes from the University of Vermont. He has been the chair of our medical advisory board for a couple of years now, taking over for our founder, Dr. Tom Easterling. With that, Ira, we welcome you and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Eleni, and good morning to everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're located, and welcome. My goal is to give you a rapid historical view of preeclampsia, including up to the day, and highlight some of the research that's going on at the end, and happy to answer questions when we've completed the presentations, if you have any about specific research activities. If you speak Greek, as Eleni does, you would know that this word is eclampsia. And this
Go
word
ahead and
actually,
share yours. You'll have to share your slides, Ira. We're not seeing your
are you not
slides.
seeing it yet?
Yeah.
We are, Lenny.
Oh, you are? Oh, just me. That's just my problem then. Okay, keep going.
Okay. So this word eclampsia first appeared in the writings of Hippocrates some 2,600 years ago. It was intended to describe seizures. It appeared in his sixth book, which were labeled the Epidemics. And while initially the seizures associated with eclampsia were not specific to pregnancy association, over the next couple of hundred years, they became very specifically associated with pregnancy. And what was understood at the time is that to have a seizure in pregnancy was a very bad thing. It was associated with a very high risk for both maternal and fetal death. And it happened before babies, often before babies were ready to be delivered or to be born. So clearly a very high risk environment. Okay. The current definitions, and I will highlight that some of the definitions vary based on geographic location. So these are the ACOG definitions, which are applicable in the United States. They all overlap significantly around the world, but some are slightly different. So if we talk about preeclampsia, the primary consideration is the development of new onset high blood pressure beyond 20 weeks of pregnancy. And that high blood pressure in and of itself is considered gestational hypertension, but when it's linked to any of these other findings, it achieves the diagnosis of preeclampsia, and that is protein in the urine, injury to the liver, abnormally low platelets, which are associated with bleeding abnormalities, injury to the kidneys, above and beyond just protein in the urine, fluid in the lungs, which we call pulmonary edema, or involvement of the brain, which can be, in the lesser degree, visual disturbances, including blindness and severe headaches. When those findings, those diagnostic criteria for preeclampsia are associated with seizure, then we achieve the diagnosis of eclampsia. Now, through the millennia, we've sought to understand the source and the reasons that this develops during the course of pregnancy. And many of you may have heard the term toxemia, which is a very common term that was initially used in association with or equivalent to the term preeclampsia. And the reason is that people were looking for the toxin. What was the product which was present in pregnancy that created this injury that would ultimately manifest as seizures, but also as other kinds of maternal and fetal injury? And this is a list of all the things that have been considered through the years. It's not comprehensive, but it significantly includes some things we no longer consider to be true contributors. The first was just fetal debris. We know this is a disease that's limited to pregnancy. So must be something about the fetus or placenta that contributes to this. And I say it's currently recycled because we now think that maybe there are parts of the placenta, which we call microvesicles, which circulate and which may contribute to the pathophysiology of this disease. For a while, people thought maybe what you ate during the course of pregnancy mattered. Too much salt. If you ate turtles, goats, or fowl, which historically wasn't too uncommon, maybe that was the cause. Uremia, maybe there was already kidney dysfunction that contributed to it, or toxins, either from individuals' guts, their intestines, or from bacterial invasion. Getting up into the more modern eras, actually, there was a worm which was identified in the 1980s, which was thought to be identified in the placenta of women with preeclampsia. Turned out it was an artifact. It didn't really exist, but it did make it into the literature. And then as we've gotten more advanced, specific chemicals and biochemicals have been identified. Prostacyclin and thromboxane are two chemicals that are produced by cells that line the vasculature and platelets that contribute to vessel diameter and vasoconstriction, which we know is an important part of the high blood pressure. We know that a group of placentas from women with preeclampsia produce oxidants. We've all heard a lot about antioxidants and their protective value. Well, maybe preeclampsia was a disease that resulted from too much generation of oxidative stress from the placenta. I can tell you that tens of thousands of women were randomized to studies to try to understand the role of antioxidants, specifically vitamin C and E, without success. And so the oxidant story has been now on the back burner for a little while. More recently, the presence of antibodies that stimulate a vasoconstricting signal. These are the AT1 autoantibodies, and are continue to be considered by some. And perhaps the most common theories currently are the presence of placentally produced chemicals that are involved with angiogenesis, which is the construction and development of blood vessels that carry red blood cells. And these are SFLT, or a soluble VEGF-R1 receptor, which, without getting into too much biochemical detail, relates to the construction and development and function of blood vessels. Now, worldwide, preeclampsia continues to account for a tremendous number of maternal deaths and fetal neonatal deaths. In the United States, we're looking at 18% best estimate of maternal deaths, 3 billion annual costs, many infant deaths, a very high cost of infant care, and many ongoing cases of cerebral palsy that are linked to children being born prematurely. It turns out it's a pretty common disease. In the United States, we're looking at rates across populations of 2 to 8%, probably around 4 to 5% based on best estimates, maybe as high as 6%, based on accurate chart reviews rather than just discharge data. And if we include all the elements of hypertension in pregnancy beyond preeclampsia, the gestational hypertension that I mentioned earlier, chronic hypertension, we may be as high as 15% of pregnancies that are affected by some hypertensive disorder during the course of pregnancy, all of which have, risky outcomes for both mother and child. Now, it turns out we do know that it runs in families. There is evidence for familial occurrence, and Leon Chesley, who's often considered one of the godfathers of preeclampsia research, began his work in the 1920s in New Jersey at the Margaret Hay Hospital and continued for 50 years, was able to identify a risk that was associated with the sisters, daughters, and granddaughters of women who developed eclampsia for either the development of preeclampsia or eclampsia. Interestingly, the daughters-in-laws, so these are the partners of the sons of the eclamptic women, had what was considered a background rate for eclampsia, suggesting that this really does get carried predominantly in the women and the women children rather than being carried by the male offspring as they enter pregnancy. Now, in terms of specific genetics, which sort of a familial occurrence implies, we do know that there are specific genetic associations that have been made, but preeclampsia is almost exclusively viewed now as multifactorial inheritance, which means we can't just pick one gene. This isn't sickle cell disease where we know there's one gene that creates the disorder. What we believe is that there are a whole series of genes which interact, and that interaction may be different in different populations, which makes it so hard to identify the genetic contributions to this disease. Now, if we look at maternal mortality overall, many of you are undoubtedly familiar with the fact that in the United States, we do not do very well on maternal mortality. We have very high rates, amongst the highest in the developed world. And you can see this demonstrated in this figure where we're looking at countries across the world, with the lowest being New Zealand, Norway, the Netherlands, all the way up to the United States, where maternal mortality per 100,000 live births has been more recently as high as in the low 20s. This data had it at 17.4. And if we think about what it is that causes maternal mortality in the United States, here sixth in line is hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. But in some ways, that's a little misleading, because if we look at other contributors, many of them get coded at the time of death in death certificates as other things, even though they may have their origins with preeclampsia, eclampsia. So other cardiovascular conditions like heart failure, cardiomyopathies, thromboses, either pulmonary or deep venous thromboses that create thromboembolism, all of those are in fact increase in the background of preeclampsia and hypertensive disorders of pregnancy. So literally 4 of the top 6 causes of maternal mortality in the United States are linked to hypertensive disorders. Now, it turns out it's not just pregnancy that we worry about with this disorder. And over the course of about the last 30 years, again, remembering that we have thousands of years of data on eclampsia, but in the last 30 years, we've recognized that women who develop preeclampsia during the course of pregnancy are at higher risk for other disorders later in life. And here's a list of them. It includes ischemic cardiovascular disease, which means heart attacks, which is with a relative risk of about twice the background population. High blood pressure, not surprising since we're talking about high blood pressure in pregnancy, with about a 4-fold risk compared to the general population. A higher risk for stroke, which is linked to hypertension. A higher risk for thrombosis, DVTs, which I mentioned earlier as a cause of death associated with pregnancy. Hyperinsulinemia, which implies high risk for diabetes and insulin resistance. And last on my list is cognitive impairment. There's pretty good evidence now that different forms of dementia, both vascular dementia and Alzheimer's, are probably both at increased risk in women who had preeclampsia during the course of their earlier pregnancies. Now, how do we think this all works today? Well, around 2000, the idea of what we call a 2-stage hypothesis was generated. And that is that the first stage is an abnormal placentation resulting from some unknown factor. So we don't know why the placenta becomes abnormal, but it does. We know that the placenta contributes because when the placenta is out, people get better, at least initially after the pregnancy. But something about that placenta is creating disease in the moms. And we say that there's something coming from that placenta that we believe results in a triad of endothelial injury, which are the cells that line the blood vessels, high blood pressure, and proteinuria. And I've mentioned a few of them here that I mentioned earlier, which are the pro-oxidants and anti-angiogenic peptides. But there are many other, actually, placental products that are being considered as potential etiologies to the maternal syndrome that we recognize. But we also know that not everybody who has these signals gets sick. So there seems to be some variability in maternal responsiveness to signals that may be the same in 2 different people during the same stage of pregnancy. So there's something clearly about the mother, there's something about the placenta, and in many cases, the placenta is abnormal. Now, it's interesting because in not all cases is the placenta abnormal. So we don't really know what this placental signal is. We presume that it's a toxin, that it's pathologic, and that's been the assumption for a lot of our research. But it may be that it's more physiologic and that it's the maternal background which creates the disorder during the pregnancy. Now, just briefly touch on some of the therapeutic options which are currently available and some in examination. So for those of you who follow this, you may well know that aspirin has been the single mainstay for the prevention of preeclampsia. And The dosing has varied depending upon the studies, but what we call low dose aspirin, somewhere between 80 and 150 milligrams a day, seems to prevent a portion of preeclampsia in women at risk. Now, if we think about the difference, we have subtypes of preeclampsia. We think that the aspirin at the higher dose seems to be better in preventing the early onset preeclampsia, which we consider preterm, less than 37 or less than 34 weeks. And in that case, it may prevent 30 to 50%, I would say, based on a breadth of data. And if we think about term preeclampsia, it's probably preventing 10 to 15% when it's being used on a daily basis. We've also learned that calcium can play a role, not in the United States, but in certain areas of the world where calcium deficiency is common. And I think most of these studies are from Central and South America. It's clear that certain forms of calcium supplementation may reduce the risk, but that's very regional and not a universal recommendation. Now, there's a lot of things being proposed that are being examined right now. And one of the interesting ones, I talked about this chemical SFLT1, S-FLT, which is involved with angiogenesis. And there's a group and a company that are active in trying to figure out how to remove this from the circulation of moms during the course of pregnancy. It's tricky. There are some preclinical studies going on right now, and I've heard some initial safety evaluations. And within the course of the next 3 to 5 years, I think we'll see the results of this kind of trial. We also have a lot of proposals and some preliminary data, I would say, not large scale, on the use of statins, better known for the control of risk for heart attack in people who have hypercholesterolemia. But statins may also play a role in their diverse effects, including an antioxidant effect on the risk for endothelial and vascular damage. And finally, the use of metformin, which is best known as an insulin sensitizer. And as I mentioned, diabetes and insulin resistance are part of the eventual consequences of prior preeclampsia. And it may be that the disorder involves some insulin resistance even in earlier stages before the postpartum long-term risks. So all of these are active. The bottom ones are active studies that are going on, some of which have some preliminary results. And some of which are under active investigation. There are others. I'm not being exhaustive in my list, but I think that I'm happy to answer any other questions that might come up as we go through today's presentation. So I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Eleni to continue. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bernstein. I'm quite sure that everybody has had all kinds of questions popping into their heads. So do please put them into chat. We do have time. We're going to do our best to leave time at the end. In order to leave time at the end, I'm going to do what's probably going to feel like a montage as I explore with you all what we do at the Preeclampsia Foundation to address the problem that you just heard Dr. Bernstein talk about. We've analyzed the problem and sort of pulled it apart into 3 pillars. And we truly believe that all 3 of these pillars are necessary to solve the problem of preeclampsia. The 3 pillars are to focus on providing education, support, and meaningful engagement for the affected community, to accelerate research toward prevention and treatment, and finally, to innovate and strengthen healthcare practices. And we do see all 3 of these as interconnected. Not any one of them is going to, quote, solve the problem. And as a result of that, we are constantly having conversations at the Preeclampsia Foundation around what are those things that are going to improve preeclampsia outcomes. And the list of these 7 things is by no means the exhaustive list of everything that's needed, but these are the things that we are currently able to embrace and do something about. And they include things like helping the moms and moms-to-be to recognize symptoms, to really lean into this idea of listening to patients, making patient education routine, and to improve accurate diagnosis, controlling high blood pressure, which includes starting with accurate measurements and even leading to self-measured or home blood pressure monitoring, aspirin prophylaxis for all women who are considered at high risk, planning for postpartum surveillance. We know that postpartum hypertensive disorders are a real thing. We do not talk about delivery as the cure for preeclampsia anymore. Providing patient and family support, particularly in cases of adverse outcomes, and helping preeclampsia survivors know and mitigate their long-term risks for cardiovascular disease. And finally, partnering and building trust with all affected communities, particularly those who have historically been marginalized. So this is where the montage comes in. I'm just going to fly through a bunch of screens that touch on some of the many things we do at the foundation, including public education via all kinds of social media platforms. I'm sure many of you have found us or follow us on some of these. We sort of lead the charge on Preeclampsia Awareness Month, which we had a very successful month in 2025. And actually, almost every year, it's been a growing area of a growing opportunity for raising awareness. Our Promise Walk for Preeclampsia is a key community event that brings families and communities together to support one another, to share experiences, learn more, and especially to raise money and awareness so that we can do this work. A quick little plug here, public service announcement, if you will, because we are halfway through the current Promise Walk season, kind of taking a little bit of a break for the summer, but there's going to be another slew of walks in the fall. If you want to grab your phone, I do have QR codes peppered throughout this presentation, which I encourage you to grab your phone. And, this is one of those instances where I don't want you to put your phone away and grab more information about any one of these. We do a lot around advocacy. We do a lot around policy and legislative advocacy. One of the key ingredients for us has been leading bipartisan federal bills or advocating for improved preeclampsia screening, more robust hospital guidelines. We do a lot of advocacy at the provider level to make tools like pregnancy validated blood pressure cuffs available to the highest risk populations. And we include patient perspectives in all the work that we're advocating for. We don't want this to become a myopic view or a kind of, as I often say, navel gazing. We want to make sure we're really representing the diverse population of those who have been affected in the work that we're doing for advocacy. Certainly one example is the fact that in 2013, we secured an official federal health observance designation for May as Preeclampsia Awareness Month. One of the more profound bits of legislation that we led the effort on was building on a major media campaign to drive awareness of the maternal mortality rate in the US. We worked intensely with ProPublica and USA Today to publish major investigative pieces that then spawned numerous other stories. This aided our lobbying efforts on Capitol Hill and resulted in the passage of the Preventing Maternal Deaths Act of 2018. We're currently in a full court press to reauthorize that bill now. Our Mama's Voices program, which many of you are familiar with, many of you are here today having come through our Mama's Voices program, is a program of the foundation, and it really is the implementation of this idea that we're really leaning into patient engagement and listening to patient voices. And the two primary ways we do that through Mama's Voices is by training and preparing patient family partners who have these lived experiences to do the work, and then providing training for healthcare providers, researchers, and others who want to and really should be including patients in their work through our lived experience integration training. Education is the root of what we do: public health education campaigns, professional training, and providing patient resources. Many of you have experienced these patient resources. I'm not even sure this 2.8 million is current anymore. I think we're well over 3 million patient education materials that have been distributed to date. This very low cost, evidence-based education materials, this package of materials, not only includes our very popular illustrated symptoms pad, which is always available in English and Spanish and about 10 other languages, but we also have a whole series of free YouTube patient education videos that you can see on our YouTube channel. Women who have experienced hypertension in pregnancy, as we heard, are at much greater risk of chronic hypertension, stroke, heart disease, and post-traumatic stress disorder. My Health Beyond Pregnancy is a worksheet that we designed in concert with the Society for Maternal Fetal Medicine, as well as the International Society for the Study of Hypertension in Pregnancy, and is really meant to be a conversation starter for patients to take to their healthcare providers and start tracking and owning and having some agency over their own healthcare as they move forward in life. You heard about aspirin. We have a whole constellation of videos and handouts and self-guided tools to help families understand, should I be taking aspirin? And if my doctor has prescribed this, what do I need to know about that? Our expert directory was launched in late 2024 and is intended to be not just a directory of maternal fetal medicine specialists, all of whom would consider themselves specialists in preeclampsia, but beyond basic training, who are the people around the country who truly are the super specialists in preeclampsia that any of you could lean into and say, hey, could I get a second opinion on my case? I've got a particularly complicated set of circumstances, and getting that higher level support. In research, which I did mention is one of our key pillars, there's a number of ways that we support our research pillar, including that we operate the Preeclampsia Registry to bring multifaceted data on multiple generations of survivors to investigators around the world. We have funded over $2 million in research through a couple of different funding programs. And we collaborate with a number of investigators actually serving on their study team, serving on a steering committee, serving as co-PIs. This idea of bringing patients to the table at the beginning of a study is critical to ensuring that the study is designed and is meeting the needs of patients. The Preeclampsia Registry, we've talked about a little bit before, but this is a living database. It is not a one-time enrollment in a study. Once you're in the registry, you have an opportunity to consent to use your data for multiple studies, and that's really the intention. The beautiful thing is we now have over 10,000 consented participants in the registry. We just hit that 10,000 mark. Very exciting. We've had dozens and dozens of studies that have used this data, and that we both internally as well as with external investigators. So one of the things that we recognize, and in not just our research on preeclampsia, but in research in general on preeclampsia, is that there are certain populations that are particularly hard hit by preeclampsia that are typically underrepresented in research. And so the gathering table events have been just one of several strategies that we've used to build authentic connection and trust with historically marginalized communities, and in this case, with communities that are, as I said, impacted at much higher rates. The overall campaign is called Take 10 for Preeclampsia Research, and it's meant to address this low representation of Black, Native American, and Pacific Islander women that we see over and over again in research. Having underrepresentation skews results, and it doesn't ensure that solutions will work for all women, and that research has been designed from input from all populations. So our gathering table events, these are some photos from our event in Washington, D.C. We had one in Atlanta, Georgia, another one in Dallas. All of these are intended to foster those connections and start building a trust in historically underrepresented communities. One of the things that we like to do is to make a concerted effort to measure the impact that we're having on our goals and objectives. This chart is one that I'm particularly inspired by, because it shows how the awareness of preeclampsia has changed since the inception of the Preeclampsia Foundation. So you can see by the way, the data comes from the registry, and because that is an ongoing research study asset, we're able to look back at pregnancies that occurred before the start of the registry in 2013, which was in 2013, all the way up to first-time moms in the present. So I think what's interesting, what you're looking at here is you want to see the blue bar getting bigger and bigger because that's demonstrating that people have heard of preeclampsia before their first diagnosis. We want to see the orange bar shrinking because those are the people who have not heard of preeclampsia before their first diagnosis. So it's very inspiring to us as we work, blood, sweat, and tears at the Preeclampsia Foundation to move the needle in this area, that a lot of the work that we've done, and we've marked a few of the kind of key milestones. The Preeclampsia Foundation was incorporated in 2020. We launched our new website and new patient education campaign in 2010. We worked diligently with ACOG and other guideline groups to include patient education as not just a nice to do, but as a mandatory piece of management. And we accomplished that in 2013. And there, of course, are many, many other programs and initiatives that we've launched. But all of this is showing the accrual of greater and greater knowledge of preeclampsia before that first diagnosis. There also, of course, are a number of other studies that have been supported by the foundation that have resulted in peer-reviewed publications, such as these that you're seeing on your screen. One that we're especially proud of is the patient journey study, which included multiple institutions and multiple authors. It was published in 2022, and it sought to analyze the abundance of patient-reported experiences and map them across the entire pre-pregnancy, pregnancy, and postpartum timeline or journey. And by the way, that QR code will take you to some of the nifty work that we did to translate a very scientific paper into a graphic story that pulls out the key findings. And what are those key findings? Well, this next chart is just a highlight of some of the not so surprising statistics. If you find yourself in these statistics, it's because you've had preeclampsia, and this is affirming a lot of your experiences. About half of us were completely unaware of the symptoms of preeclampsia before we were diagnosed. And even more significant is that 85% of us would have responded differently to our symptoms had we known them. Not surprising, there's a significant negative impact on our emotional well-being in the postpartum period. And 80% of us were given no information about our later life risks. All of this flows directly into what are we trying to do about healthcare practices, because that's where a lot of the burden of how do we fix this needs to lie. We need to ensure that there is continuing education, not just for physicians, but nurses, other allied healthcare professionals, and community health workers. We want to make sure that they're equipped with patient resources, both digitally as well as paper and online, that can encourage their patient education work. And finally, our Cuff Kit program, which offers home blood pressure monitoring kits with special patient education. We do have special resources for people like nursing groups and doulas, and those are available on our website. Our Cuff Kit program has turned into a phenomenal, enduring response, not just during COVID when everyone moved to telehealth, but even beyond the COVID pandemic, when we realized that home blood pressure monitoring can fill a gap in between prenatal visits and in between postpartum visits. So it is a package of care that includes a pregnancy validated blood pressure device that also is offered in an extra large cuff, as well as patient education materials that explain how and when to take your blood pressure, what the numbers mean, and when to seek help. We've now distributed over 60,000 of these through 786 different providers across 34 states, and that even includes Canada. So that's my quick montage of why we're exhausted here at the Preeclampsia Foundation. But I also wanted to take this opportunity because it is our 25th anniversary. And it caused me to just pause and look at What are some of the lessons that we have learned in 25 years? And lessons learned are not always from making bad decisions. Sometimes they're learned from making good decisions, seeing positive outcomes, and thinking, what did we do right? So these are just some of the many things that I thought were interesting, and that I'm just going to take a couple minutes to go over. When we launched, and this is really, I would say, if you're somebody who's here with another organization, this is an opportunity to internalize some of these lessons in your own development of your organizations. One of the things that we did in the early years that I absolutely give 100% credit to the founders for doing is not building the organization around a single school of thought or a single investigator who was sort of the flavor of the month. They may have significant they may have had significant gravitas in what they were doing, but the reality is that almost all medical conditions need a diverse representation of viewpoints to build credibility as an organization. So that was a big thing that we did in the early years. We also, at the time, keeping in mind where we were with the internet, invested in the only online source of accurate information for patients. We started funding research, which immediately built respect in the research community. And we started attending those medical and scientific meetings with the intent to learn, absorb as much as we could, and begin to engage with the scientific community. The middle years, what I call sort of the growing up years, started with recognizing that, and this sounds a little bit tongue in cheek, but we needed to build a business, not a club. And what I mean by that is not that this isn't a passion project. It absolutely is. But we needed to run it like a business, not just a cause. Passion takes us a long way, but it's not enough. We needed to have sound financial practices, accountability, results-based practices, earning the highest ratings possible from charity watchdog organizations, engaging objective, skillful, influential board members, and hiring the best staff that we could possibly afford. We also happen to have done that hiring of staff with a lot of people with personal passion, and that's a bonus. So a lot of those have been drivers to some of those growing up year things, mastering persuasive advocacy. I will tell you, I've had more than one person tell me that the way we show up to tell our stories is unique. And the reason it's unique is because we marry stories and data, humanizing data and quantifying and legitimizing the stories. They go hand in hand. We also recognize that while we were intent on providing patient support, it alone was not going to cure preeclampsia. We also said yes to a lot of opportunities. We started developing an evidence base and built a structure for why patient education mattered and how to do it. And finally, we realized that we needed to show up as an advocate, not as an activist. Somebody once gave me this beautiful visual that recognized you need both activists and advocates to change the world. Activists stand in front of the building with their banners and their bullhorns, and they raise attention and they call attention to a problem. Advocates are the ones who are then invited inside the building and to sit at the table and figure out how are we going to collaboratively solve this problem. You need both, but we made the deliberate decision that we wanted to be at the decision table. So that meant that we needed to really lean into being collaborators and recognizing the value that everybody brings to the table. As somebody wise once said, nobody wakes up in the morning going, I think I'm going to do a bad job today. We have to appreciate the fact that everybody's here because they want to do a good job. So legitimizing patient engagement, using our credibility and cachet to push harder against some of the intractable history, issues like equity, the need for innovation, the need for listening to the patient voice. We're now at a point that we need to get a little bit more discriminating. We can't say yes to everything if we really want to move the needle. We also have worked hard to diversify our funding streams and finally to pay it forward, to start opening the doors for others. The last screen I'm going to show, and then we're totally opening this up to Q&A, is just a list of some of the publications that have talked more about us. This is not the exhaustive list of everything we've ever published, but these particular publications, if you want to learn more about the Preeclampsia Foundation, would be ones that I would encourage you to follow up on. I'm going to go ahead and drop link. Actually, if you do a screenshot of this, you'll be able to follow this and find every one of these on PubMed, with the exception of the one on the left. I'm going to pause right there and open it up for Q&A. And